And we're live. And so, yes, we're going to discuss Joseph Stalin, or over to Jonathan to try to pronounce his real name.
Joseph Chugashvili. There's something like that. It's not very exciting.
Right. So, maybe, what do you think of the idea of sort of like going through his life from the beginning to the end?
If you like.
Yeah.
So, what was the impetus for this video, by the way?
Well, the impetus
The impetus.
was Whittier mentioned that she's interested in uh, history, and when I asked her about a area, she said that no, actually, she said she was interested in history, and then I mentioned, oh, Jonathan, he studied history in Scotland, 4-year degree, and then sort of like I thought, oh, and you have other things in common, and then it sort of went on from there, and then she mentioned she had an interest in studying the Soviet Union, and then it went to that. I don't wish to give too many details because we should talk about the great dictator.
Okay.
Because I could go on for like 10 minutes about all the steps.
Yes. So, you want to start with his childhood, his life?
Yeah, I reckon if we could, it gives a structure to the event.
All right. I'll go to certain details. He was born in Georgia in 18th December 1978. Although he actually lied about his date of birth for some inexplicable reason, he claimed it was a year younger than he was. So that was kind of strange for historians to find out. His father was a drunk and a shoemaker who often wasn't at home, and when he was, he would beat his son. I don't know if he beat his wife as well, and sometimes drag his son to the shoemakers and force him to work there. Stalin hated it. Stalin also was a bit of a troublemaker as a child. He was the area he grew up in was quite rural and quite sort of tough guys and violent sort of gangs around. He was one of them. And in one case, he injured his arm. I think he was hit by a carriage or something, and so he was left with a withered arm, which was brushed out of his sort of propaganda. I can't remember if his father died or not. But his father I think his father either died or disappeared, one or the other. Because most of the time he was raised by his mother, he was very religious, and his mother pushed for him to join a seminary and become a priest, particularly since he was a very, very intelligent young man. He read a lot. Like when he was in his early teens, she gave him a copy of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, and he read through it in a couple of days. It also convinced him to be an atheist, which made joining the priesthood a little bit awkward.
That's no problem these days, at least for the Church of England. Anyhow, back on track.
Okay, snark aside. She had a friend of the family who helped him get in there, and he excelled. He did great in all the classes. He was also kind of like the hall monitor sort of role. At the same time, he was also one of the biggest troublemakers. So he was, even as young as that, he was the guy enforcing the rules and the guy breaking them at the same time. And still a very voracious reader. He would do things like mug kids for their books in order to read them himself. And he was involved in, as he got older, he got more involved in like secret book clubs because of the seminary had a very strict reading regime. So the students were quite rebellious. They would have secret clubs where they would read forbidden literature, including the works of Marx, and that's how he became a Marxist. Eventually, he chose to leave just before he was to take his vows. The seminary begged to have him back because he was one of their best students ever, but he refused. Instead, he got a job at an observatory, which, pretty impressive for a first job. And he also started becoming more dedicated Marxist revolutionary, and he got involved in trade union activity and organizing strikes and being quite the provocateur. He quite liked provoking violence against the factory owners and stuff in order to is the basically a standard tactic among the more radical Marxists was to, organize a strike and demand peace, but at the same time try and get the managers or the capitalist class, whatever, angry enough to use violence against the strikers in the hopes that people will be horrified, so horrified by that violence that they'll get more and more support and that will lead to bigger things. So that's the sort of thing that he got up involved with. While he was there, he was reading about Lenin, and he was quite impressed by Lenin's writings. But when he finally saw Lenin for the first time at a kind of conference for East European revolutionaries, he wasn't terribly impressed. He thought this guy didn't really seem to be much of a leader. He didn't seem to have much of a sense of power. Like Stalin felt that he had a very good sense of power, like he knew how to enter a room and how to watch people. He wrote about this. This is his own thoughts. Whereas Lenin seemed to be kind of a novice at that sort of thing. But nonetheless, they got to know each other and they still had friendship, and he came to quite like and admire Lenin. And Lenin liked to admire Stalin because he saw Stalin as a hard and tough and ruthless man who could do the dirty work. And in that capacity, Stalin and a few others were put in charge of raising funds for the hold on, what was the right name? Because this is a difficult thing. Type in the name of the party. Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, as it was known then. Because the party had been first of all, the party had problems in Russia raising funds because of crackdowns by the police. And secondly, the party was being divided between the Leninists and the Martovists. Martov, I think. I'll double check that name because I think it's Martov. Mensheviks, basically. Yeah, Martov. Always Martov. So Lenin wanted to find new ways of raising money, but he also wanted to make sure most of that money went to the Bolsheviks, to his faction. And so Stalin's job and the job of this little group was to raise money by criminal means. So they were involved in a lot of really serious crimes like kidnapping, bank robbery, racketeering, murder for hire, things like that. And eventually it came to a head where they were involved in a really big robbery in Tbilisi, I believe. I could be getting that wrong, but I believe that's a town, and it was quite a notorious robbery involving a lot of shooting and a bomb and a few victims. Trotsky was charged with investigating and seeing if Stalin and his gang were involved and if they were involved in criminal activity for the party, which the party does not approve of. But Stalin denied it, and this was perhaps the beginning of the tension between Stalin and Trotsky. So, and of course, Lenin was able to he approved of everything Stalin was doing, but he also kind of carefully kept his distance as far as not being tied to anything. So yeah. Also, around this time, Jugashvili, as he was known, was using different aliases. One was Koba, which was the name of a character in a novel he liked as a child. It was kind of a violent Robin Hood sort of person. Another was Soso. I forgot to mention that Stalin was actually a poet. That's not quite well known, but he was apparently quite eloquent in his native language and got published in a local newspaper. And so keeping track of his movements has been a little bit tricky at times because obviously he's not being known as Stalin at this point. It's not quite known why he called himself Stalin or why Lenin called himself Lenin. But he wasn't called by those names yet, just using different nomenclatures.
I'll just say for the audience, I think Stalin means steel in Russian.
Stalin means something like Mara Steel, but Lenin, we don't know quite where that came from. So he's having all these aliases. He manages to evade the police, sometimes by just sheer luck. This eventually leads to rumors that he's secretly an informant with the Russian police, but there's really no evidence for that because when the government is finally overthrown, it's not overthrown by the Bolsheviks, it's overthrown by more liberal revolutionaries, and they raid the secret police, the Okhrana, and they expose all of the informants. And it does include a lot of people that was close to Lenin, people that Lenin trusted, but Stalin was not on the list. So it's unlikely that Stalin was a police informant because if he was, he would have been exposed long before he was in a position to hide it. So at some point, he gets arrested and he's exiled to Siberia and into the deepest part of Siberia because he's more violent. Whereas Lenin and Trotsky, they get exiled too, but they get exiled to kind of like the nicer parts of Siberia where they manage to be, go for daily walks and eat well and swim well and things like that. While there, he has kind of a roommate. Damn it, I can't. No, I'm misremembering certain details. I can't remember. I can't remember the name of this guy, but there was a prominent Bolshevik who was quite important in the party, who Stalin was a roommate with, and at first they were friends, but after a while, this guy just came to really dislike Stalin, and this guy might have been a contender for the leadership, but he died of sickness before that happened. But anyway, like a lot of revolutionaries, he managed to get away from Siberia because it was quite easy. There wasn't really any security in that area. I think I'm getting some dates mixed up here because I think this may have been later. There was also a period where he visited Vienna.
Yeah. So just to interrupt for a moment, Jonathan, if you keep us with a timeline when you have a date to sort of anchor us.
Yeah, I'm getting my.
Because wasn't there a revolutionary attempt in Russia in like in the first decade of the 20th century? Yeah. Was he involved in that?
He wasn't really involved in that. It did lead to the crackdown that I talked about that led to him getting involved in organised crime. Can you give me 1 second? My tap is dripping.
Okay. So, what do you think so far, Witzia? Thumbs up for Jonathan?
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm just enjoying listening to everything at the moment.
It's drawing me in as well, and I've got ADHD. Very good, Jonathan.
All right. So, Yeah, he's not really involved in that thing. It does affect the his criminal enterprises. 1905 is also the year when he meets his wife, Nadia, who at the time he's a bit of a womanizer. For a long time, he's a bit of a womanizer. But he marries Nadia, who's a bit younger than him, and she gives birth to, I think, one son, I'm not sure. Later on, she'll end up shooting herself.
Is that his first wife or his second one?
His first wife.
Okay.
First wife shoots herself. I think. Let me double check that.
I
No,
know,
Nadia. Sorry, I'm getting that
Mhm.
mixed up. Nadia is Wedding's wife. Nadia's Wedding's wife. Oh. Yeah. Forget what I just. Suppose. Yeah, his first wife is Ekaterine Keto, and she dies of tuberculosis. Second wife is the one who kills herself. Thank you for correcting me there, because I was getting that
No worries.
a little mixed up. So he marries Kato Savindes in 1906. They have a son, Yakov, who famously he does not save from the Nazis. Yeah, he's arrested and he's sent to a prison in Baku, where he's involved in killing suspected informants within the prison. Volgoda province. Yeah, he's exiled, but it's not to Siberia yet. It's to the Volgoda province, which is in the west of Russia. But again, he escapes the village. He escapes the village disguised as a woman. Then he gets arrested again. He's having affairs. I'm just using Wikipedia to keep a track of things. I know all this, but again, I was getting my days mixed up. He's sentenced to prison a few more times. He gets exiled to Siberia again. He escapes. Yakov Sverdlov is the Bolshevik that I was talking about, who dies of illness.
Whilst Jonathan's looking at that, I'll just say that this book, Khrushchev Remembers, a lot of information about Stalin from his point of view. Khrushchev as a Ukrainian, and he writes about how Stalin treated his daughter.
There's also a book that his daughter wrote. It's called Stalin's Daughter, which is actually really good to see, like, how even she, as her daughter, was scared of him and didn't trust him, which speaks a lot about the kind of person that he was.
So, have you read this book, Witzia? Apparently, he said things like Khrushchev would make sure that, like he said, bad things happened to people who fell asleep at Stalin's table. So he made sure he had a nap in the afternoon, and Khrushchev was already sort of like middle-aged at the time, and Stalin would like ask him to dance for him, and he would dance. And he actually has that quote: "When Stalin asked you to dance, you danced." Yeah. So this was written when after, and it's sort of like, apparently it was sort of like snuck out of the Soviet Union and published in Germany. Apparently the tapes, the interview tapes, were snuck out. So yeah, an entertaining read from what little I've read of it.
Yeah. So in 1912, there's elections in Moscow. They're the Tsarist regime is experimenting with democracy, and 12 members of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party are elected. 6 of whom are Bolsheviks and 6 of whom are Mensheviks. Stalin is for reconciliation, but Lenin's against it, and Stalin sides with Lenin. Stalin also travels to Vienna in January 1913, which is kind of an infamous moment because at that particular point in Vienna, he's there to meet Trotsky, but Hitler is there, and so is Freud, and so is Alfred Adler, and a whole bunch of famous people are living in Vienna at that time. So it's kind of an infamous historical moment.
Was Ludwig von Mises there?
I possibly, I don't know if I remember.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, this is also when he writes Marxism and the National Question, which is kind of a basically Stalin's ideas. He's trying to understand how Marxism can be reconciled to nationalism because he's aware that different regions have their own cultural identity. So in a way, he's sort of experimenting with National Socialism, but not as the Germans would practice it, not as Hitler would practice it, or socialism in one country. But that's sort of what he's touching on here.
I'll just as there's a little bit off topic, but this actually became a thing with, and maybe we could do Mussolini in future, where and how Mussolini left, because he was part of the Socialist Party in Italy.
Yes.
And the socialists at the time wanted to be independent of the nations of the Great War. And so whereas Mussolini felt that he should be, again, socialism for Italy. And so it was a different conception there. And this goes along with how people misunderstand Italian fascism. But as you said there was a tendency, wasn't there originally, Jonathan, that the socialists were international and were against the idea of the nation, and that this was a world cause.
Yes, that's a key
workers
point.
of the world unite. Yeah.
Yes, actually, I may have had that backwards. Stalin's kind of analyzing the topic, but he's somewhat criticizing it. Yeah, he's arguing. What Stalin's arguing for is, like all Marxists, he wants an international community, but he's addressing the issue of nationalism and socialism. He does understand, though, that they have their own distinct identities, and that'll become important later on when he's a dictator. So, obviously, in 1914, the war breaks out, and this leads to a massive split in the socialist movement worldwide, because up to this point, the Second Workers' International, which is the international annual conference of different socialist and radical groups, they had previously agreed that they would all support pacifism in the event of a war. They'll go for peace, and yeah, when war finally comes, they all say, a lot of them, including the Germans, support their own countries, and this leads to the breakup of, kind of the breakup of the Second International. Technically, it still exists as a moderate organization, but Lenin will establish the Third International when they take over in 1917. This is what leads to Lenin to break away from that, and also he says, I am no longer a social democrat, I am a communist. So this is the beginning of the Communist Party. And the differences between socialist and communist and social democratic would be a video in itself. So Stalin at this point, he is in, he's just in Europe, went back and forth in Europe and Russia, and he gets arrested in 1913 and he's sent to Siberia. There are more parts of Siberia. This is when he gets sent to that really far away remote part. and he has an affair with a 14-year-old girl who gives birth to a child who dies, and another child who lives for a little longer. And while he's in exile in Siberia, that's when the Tsar is overthrown in the February Revolution. And news of that leads him to hop on the train and just go all the way back to St. Petersburg. And Lenin at the time is in Switzerland. Now, this means that Stalin and Trotsky and Lev Kamenev end up becoming more or less the leaders of the Bolshevik party in St. Petersburg, and Trotsky will eventually flee, so for a while Stalin and Kamenev will be in charge. Lenin at this point, as soon as he hears that he's in Switzerland, and he gets in touch with a German communist that he despises and says, you know what, I'm going to put aside our differences for a second. Yes, it was renamed to Petrograd. Put aside our differences, I want help from the Germans to get back into Russia, and in return I will overthrow the government, or I will do my best to overthrow the government. This German socialist talks to Field Marshal Ludendorff, who's one of the guys in charge of the German war effort. Ludendorff listens to what he says about Marxism and Leninism. He does not understand any of it. All Ludendorff understands is that this guy says he'll overthrow the Russian government and get them out of the war, because even though there's been a revolution, the revolutionaries don't accept the German terms, so they're staying in the war. Ludendorff will eventually say that, unlike a lot of German nationalists will think the Russian Revolution is a disaster, but Ludendorff's very proud of it. He thinks it's his greatest military victory ever, stroke of genius, because in one stroke he gets, the Russians out of the war. So Lenin's idea is that this is supposed to be a big secret, but it is not. It's leaked, and when Lenin goes to the train station in Switzerland, there's a huge mob of journalists asking him if he's a traitor to his country and all that. And this is how the world really first meets Vladimir Lenin on the international stage. And he famously goes into a closed-off train with a bunch of other revolutionaries, and they go all the way through Germany, all the way to Russia. Lenin's really paranoid about this. He's convinced, because he's terrified that they'll be arrested, but when they get there, they're welcomed as heroes. They're very popular. So this is early 1917. In the summer of 1917, there is kind of a revolution of sorts. Not yet, Ben. There's kind of a revolution of sorts in the middle of 1917, but it's more of a spontaneous thing that the Bolsheviks are not organizing. They try and take advantage of it. There's a lot of expectation that the Bolsheviks are going to overthrow the government because, as I said, it's the worst kept secret in the world that Lenin's there to overthrow the government. But because this failed revolution, Lenin runs off to Finland, and Trotsky goes away as well. And this is when Stalin and Kamenev take charge of the communist government, and they decide later in the year, by October, November, that they should wait a little longer. It's not quite time to overthrow the government, even though the Bolsheviks are going quite popular. Partly because the first ever truly free elections in Russia are coming up. You need to understand that at this point, there's kind of two governments going on. There's the main government in St. Petersburg, but there's also the Soviets, which are the workers' councils, which are all over, and the political parties are kind of standing for election in both, and there's some tension there. Well, the Bolsheviks are quite popular in the Soviets, but Stalin and Kamenev want to wait for the general election to see how much seats they'll get. Lenin is having none of this. Lenin is furious when he learns of this, so he smuggled himself back into Russia. He shaved his famous beard, and he barges into a secret meeting, and he says, "None of us are leaving until I've convinced you." He uses a lot of swearing to I've convinced all of you that we're going to be having this revolution right now. So Lenin spends several hours just arguing with them and browbeating them all until they agree to go on with the revolution, which they do, and it's successful. They make a big deal out of how dramatic it was later on, but at the time it was a kind of disorganized, and I don't think anyone really died, or very few people died at the time. Yes, the calendar changed in Russia around this time, so in the old calendar it's the October Revolution, but technically it was in November. As soon as the Bolsheviks take over, pretty much the whole government goes on strike. They don't recognize the legitimacy of it. Then the general election goes ahead, and the Bolsheviks do not win. Other parties, including the Mensheviks, do well. There's another party called the Social Revolutionaries, which do well, and they're kind of split between the left SR and the right SR. The left SR sides with the Bolsheviks, and the right SR is against them. There's a general feeling that the Bolsheviks are not the legitimate government. They don't have any right to be doing this, but they're acting like it. So the winning Bolsheviks are going into their offices and they're finding that no one's going to work for them at all. They're all saying we don't recognize you, and they're fine with that. So, their main interest is actually that comes a bit later. I think. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, the Bolsheviks are mostly interested in getting hold of like treaties and stuff to expose the corruption of the Tsar and the old government. And the Bolsheviks are also hoping that this will lead to this revolution, this communist revolution in Russia will inspire communist revolutions in the rest of Europe, especially in Germany, which will make up for the fact that by their own Marxist logic, Russia is not ready for any kind of revolution like this. It doesn't work. There are communist parties and social parties do become a lot more popular in Germany and elsewhere, and there is a communist revolution in Hungary, I believe, but the German government, the Kaiser's government remains, and so there's a lot of questions amongst people about where the Bolsheviks' loyalties lie. This comes to a head when the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed in 1918, early 1918. The Bolsheviks have been putting it off for months. The Germans have been wanting to sign this for ages. The Bolsheviks are just hoping that if they drag their heels long enough, then revolution will happen. It doesn't happen. And the Germans eventually get tired and say, look, either you sign this treaty or we invade, war's back on again. So the Bolsheviks reluctantly sign it, and the version they sign is actually harsher than the one they were offered originally. But the Germans are really annoyed with the Bolsheviks at the time.
I'll just say that I think that because of that treaty, did Russia lose control of Finland and the Baltic states?
Yes, that's definitely part of this. I can't remember the exact geographical details, but there was a lot of land. And there's also a funny story where on their way, Trotsky was the lead negotiator, and he and a few others, when they're on their way to the Eastern Front to meet the Germans to start their talks, they realise that they don't have any representatives for the peasants. And so when they're driving down the road, they see a random peasant just walking down the road, and they stop and they kidnap him and they drag him all the way to the Eastern Front, and he just sits there and completely silent. He has no idea what's going on. Poor guy.
I'll just say, Witzia, was Poland part of the Russian Empire at the time?
I don't think so.
We'll double check.
I think after the war, I think they got pushed into that area. After the Alta Conference, I think.
Oh, the World War One. Yeah, no, it was still. The World War I started post-territory was split between Austria-Hungary, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and it became the scene of a lot of fights in World War I. So there was no, it was not independent. It was being contested by different empires. It becomes independent after the war. And Trotsky is so upset with the final treaty that he just, even though it's that bad because of Trotsky's own fault, he's so upset with it that he refused to sign his name on it. So someone else does. But anyway, this leads to massive outrage among Russians, even amongst Russian leftists, like the left social revolutionaries, their allies, because they thought Lenin and the Bolsheviks have just betrayed Russia. They've just handed Russia over to the Kaiser. They've allowed the Kaiser to win World War One, and this basically triggers a wave of terrorist attacks by radical Russian leftists, like the Russian SR, against the Bolsheviks, which in turn leads, in fact, including the assassination of the German ambassador. And this leads to also Lenin gets shot as part of this.
I'll just have a stat for you, because I remember them stating on the Great War Channel that in 1914 Russia had the 4th largest economy in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Just a stat for you, but then I don't know what the other countries were like after that.
Yeah. So this leads to the Red Terror, which starts as a campaign against radical leftists who are not Bolsheviks, but it has expanded to pretty much everyone who's against the Bolsheviks or who the Bolsheviks are against. And basically the Russian Civil War. In the process, Lenin gets shot by a left social revolutionary assassin acting on her own. And so the Russian Civil War happens. Stalin himself is not too involved in this at this point. He's kind of he's in charge of some armies, but he's not very good at the job. The main actor in this is Trotsky, because he's head of the Red Army. He's quite a good organizer and quite a good orator. And he leads a lot of campaigns of terror as well. And the Russian Civil War is primarily against the Whites, which are the reactionary conservative forces, but they're kind of at least three separate armies, and none of them want to return to Tsarism per se. They might want to put the Tsar on the throne as a puppet. They've all got their own agendas and are all united. There's also the Mensheviks, and there's also the anarchists and the peasants, and they're fighting everyone. The whole thing's a mess. St. Petersburg's in chaos, so the Bolsheviks moved to Moscow. That's why Moscow is the capital today, or Petrograd, as Ben said. But eventually the Bolsheviks win, and Lenin has to retire because the gunshot assassination attempt, although he survived, is kind of infected and becomes quite sick. And so Stalin, who's the member of the Politburo, which is the general secretary of the Politburo, which is the 7-man central committee of the party and the government, Stalin starts to take control. He does this partly by isolating Lenin from everyone else, by making sure that his people are in charge of Lenin's health. This leads to fights with Lenin's wife, Nadia, who does not like Stalin at all, and Stalin insults her, and Lenin rebukes him, and Lenin writes a famous letter condemning Stalin. He condemns all the members of the Politburo. He says that Stalin and Trotsky are the two best candidates for leadership, and ideally they would work together. But Stalin is just a bit too mean and crude a character, and he's getting too much power. So Stalin should be removed from the Central Committee, and Trotsky should be in charge. But they don't really listen to Lenin because he doesn't have any power at this point. And also, to be honest, a lot of them, they admired him and they respected him, but they didn't particularly like him because Lenin was kind of a jerk.
What was the effect of his strokes? Because Lenin had a number of strokes, and how
Yeah.
that affected, say, maybe his mental capacity.
His mental capacity was generally pretty good for quite a while, but he wasn't able to work as hard as long. He couldn't be in position of power. Eventually, he got very, very bad, and he could barely talk. But for a while, he could still at least write and issue demands that no one was listening to. But yeah, so Lenin dies, and Stalin has already begun to build a cult of personality around Lenin, which and making kind of a pseudo-religious figure, which Lenin, particularly and especially Nadia, and Lenin's family are a bit resentful of. And eventually he turns Lenin into a full-blown martyr and building statues and stuff, even though Lenin didn't like statues. He also arranges things that Trotsky misses Lenin's funeral to embarrass him. And Trotsky, though, is not a very good politician. He's a great administrator, he's a good journalist, great military leader, but he's not very politically savvy, so he ends up shooting himself in the foot more often than not. So eventually Stalin takes charge and he manages to according to Trotsky, three fractions form. There's the left opposition, the centrists, and the right opposition. Now, Trotsky does not really like Stalin, but he doesn't understand him either. He kind of underestimates him. He thinks Stalin is kind of like a dull, boring bureaucrat of average intelligence who doesn't have any original thoughts. And he thinks his main enemy is a guy called Bukharin, who's the leader of the right opposition. The main difference between the left opposition and the right opposition is that the left opposition, which is Trotsky's lot, want to have a full-blown world revolution and full-blown collectivization, bring the revolution everywhere. The right opposition thinks that this is, too early. Like, we had our opportunity, it didn't work. Clearly, the revolution in Germany isn't happening. Well, there were revolutions after World War II, but they failed. There was also the war in Poland.
You said World War II. You mean World War One?
World War One, I meant, yeah. After World War One, there were socialist communist revolutions in Germany, but they failed. They were quashed, and they were quashed by a combination of the German socialists, who were the new government, and the German military establishment, which also led to a lot of resentment against socialism by the communists. There's also the new government in Poland invaded Ukraine, and then this led to the Russians invading Ukraine and then trying to invade Poland. This is all under Lenin, but they get pushed back. So basically, there was a general feeling that the world revolution was on hold right now. So the right opposition argued for socialism in one country, and also for the continuation of the new economic program, which was kind of a pseudo-capitalism. So Stalin sided with the right opposition, whereas the other two centrists, who were Kamenev and Zinoviev, Zinoviev was sort of a Lenin lackey, but he then became a bit of a middle guy. They sided with the Trotskyists. So the right opposition won, and Trotsky got exiled. And then eventually there were show trials, starting with Kamenev and Zinoviev, who were accused of, nefarious conspiracies and stuff, and they had to publicly admit their guilt, even though they weren't really guilty of anything, and shame. And then allies of Trotsky had to do the exact same thing, and Trotsky ended up fleeing across the world. He constantly was exiled to a country which would then exile him, and so on, and eventually arrives in Mexico after a while. And then the Stalin kind of turns against the righteous as well and cements his own authority. Yeah, we should probably save it. Yeah. So yeah, we don't really have a lot of time to cover all of this, but basically Stalin at this point has cemented his power, and this leads to the 1920s where he's in charge, and then you get the famine 5-year plan, and then you get to the 30s where Stalin initiates the reign of terror, or the Great Terror rather, which starts with the death of someone who's my mind's gone all blank anyway. Someone dies, and it may have been he may have been killed by someone, or he may have been killed by Stalin. But this leads to Stalin's crackdown on all of his opponents and all the Trotskyists, and then everyone else. I'm kind of rambling at this point. So yeah,
I'll just put pictures up of the various people as you mention them. If you get to anybody.
I'll just look up.
Yeah, I remember seeing some from an old documentary where they mentioned the new economic policy, and there was sort of footage of like almost like they were doing market stuff. I don't know how much capitalism they were doing.
Yeah, basically they started off trying to implement socialism, but it wasn't really working. So Sergei Kirov, that was the guy. He was murdered, and there's sort of conspiracies that Stalin himself had him murdered in order to justify his terror. But whether or not that happened, Stalin certainly supported it. And then he used it to kill all his enemies, cement his authority. Stalin may have been inspired by Hitler actually, because because the Great Terror started in 1936, and Stalin admired Hitler's purge in 1934, the Night of the Long Knives. Oi.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting collusion between the Soviet Union and Germany in the 1920s.
Yes.
To get around the Treaty of Versailles, and the Germans were giving technology to the Russians, and they would let the Germans go over to the Soviet Union to like develop their tactics and improve their military tactics, and I think they had a joint training establishment sort of thing going on, and maybe it was in the 30s or 20s. It was when the Soviets talked about how oil was so important to the Germans in their negotiations that it led to that belief. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, where they would say with Operation Barbarossa that the majority of the Soviet forces were in the south, because they said based on their they knew how important the oil was, and they said something like, if the Germans take Moscow, it would be a great tragedy, but all they would gain is accommodation. If they were to take the south, with the Ukraine as well, with the oil, with the food that's there and the oil, said if they took the south, if they took the Caucasus, it would be catastrophic. And that was like the main plot, and that was Howder. That was Howder's fault, because Hitler compromised with the German generals, but he said that the main thrust should be south to get the food from Ukraine and the oil from the Caucasus. But Howder, who was thinking tactically rather than strategically, he wanted to do the main thrust on Moscow and win in the same way that they won against France. So that was something I've learned from watching the videos with Tick. And that's more on the economic aspects of it. And also with the autarky policy in Germany, because Hitler believed in the shrinking markets, He didn't want to export because he thought that if he exported technology, other people would copy the technology and then they wouldn't need them. But what he didn't realize is that, well, they're always going to have that. They're always going to be ahead. It's like Germany has exported technology for decades, but they're still ahead and able to export the next round of technology that's moved on. And the same with Japan. Anyway, back on track.
Yeah. Is there any questions or comments or anything that's been said?
Witzia.
I'm not currently. I don't really know a lot about the World War One side of things. I'm like more known about World War Two side of things. So I'll have more questions then.
Right.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So maybe we should sum up. Should we mention a bit about typology, or
Just leave that
not?
for leave that for
Only that for the end. Yeah. I think Sergei Kirov is the one that the Soviet battle cruisers were named after, the Kirov battle cruisers.
probably. It was
Yeah.
kind of a marker for the terror, was it?
Right. So, what year have we ended with? Where were we up to in the chronology?
We got to the mid-30s.
Oh, all the way up to the mid-30s. Right.
I skipped over a lot near the end. Really, most of it was I got up to the 20s and I just skipped through a few more things.
Right. So at this point, Stalin has met Hitler. What did Stalin think of Hitler at this point?
Stalin never met Hitler.
You're right. You're right. Yes, he didn't, but he had interactions with him at a distance via intermediaries. What did he think of Hitler?
He thought different things at different points. Like when Hitler first came to power, and that's the whole topic in itself, because he kind of directed the communists to let Hitler take power because it would be more useful, he claims, than forming a coalition with the socialists, or social fascists as they called them. His argument was that if the communists took power peacefully, then they would not be able to be as revolutionary as. Whereas if Hitler took power, then they can organize a revolution. And this obviously did not work. And then he admires Hitler for the purge and the online stuff. We only have 5 minutes left before.
Right. So what should we do? End recording and then chat for a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. Well, so folks, hold your horses and hold on to the edge of your seats for another week, maybe, for part 2. I'm going to end the recorder.